Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Paul Rose. I'm the Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the law school's first major event of this academic year, the Klatsky Endowed Distinguished Lecture in Human Rights. The Klatsky Lecture was created in 2001 by Case Western Reserve alum Bruce J. Klatsky, who is the former CEO of Phillips Van Heusen and a member of the Board of Directors of Human Rights Watch. The Klatsky Endowment also provides annual fellowships to 2 case students at Human Rights Watch, and a few months ago, Bruce Klatsky added to the endowment to provide permanent funding for the Cox International Law Center's annual conference. This year's Cox Center conference, to be held on September 27th, will explore whether there is a need to update the 75-year-old, Geneva Conventions on the Laws of War to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The Klatsky Endowment has been the core around which our school has built a world-class human rights program. The program includes our Nobel Peace Prize nominated War Crimes Prosecution Lab, Dean Sharp's Talking Foreign Policy radio show, and our Yemen Accountability Project, which is paving the way for accountability for war crimes in the Yemen Civil War. Now to introduce our 2024 Klatsky Lecture, I'm pleased to turn the podium over to Dean Michael Scharf, who is now Associate Dean for Global Legal Studies and is President of the American branch of the International Law Association. Dean Scharf.
Thank you very much, Paul. We are so lucky to have this man as our new dean. So how about another applause for our new dean? Well, it is my pleasure to introduce the 2024 Klatsky Lecturer. And as part of the Klatsky Lecture, we also give our Humanitarian of the Year award. Let me tell you a little bit about Andrew Cayley. I have known Andrew for about 20 years. He has had every position imaginable in the field of international criminal justice, from defense counsel to trial attorney and even chief prosecutor of the Cambodia Genocide Tribunal. Now he was chosen to have the unenviable and challenging task of being the lead trial attorney for the International Criminal Court's most recent cases. So today he's going to give us a little bit of an inside view of what's going on at the ICC. But before he does, it is my pleasure to present him with the Cox International Law Center's Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice for his lifetime contributions to this field. Andrew Cayley. The floor is yours, Mr. Prosecutor.
Dean Paul Rose, Professor Michael Scharf, faculty members, and students of the university, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this award. It means a very great deal indeed to me to be recognized like this after a fair number of years in these fields of law. And I say fields of law because it doesn't just include international criminal law. As has been said, and Michael has put it very carefully, but I better spell it out to you. I'm currently lead counsel at the International Criminal Court working on the Palestine case, which is not without its challenges. Those challenges, frankly, are political rather than legal. If we were a world of laws rather than a world of men and women, it might all be much easier. In this situation in Palestine, 5 applications for warrants of arrest were made in May of this year. A public statement was made by the Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan, King's Counsel, at the same time about these 5 cases. You can see that online. We know that at least one person against whom an application for arrest has been made is dead. Ismail Haniyeh, killed in Iran on the 31st of July 2024. These applications that were made in May, they remain under judicial consideration, so they are sub judice. So what I will say about them today publicly will only reflect what the Chief Prosecutor has already publicly stated, nothing more. So, if I may, and bearing in mind the award today, I'm going to speak more about my personal journey now, nearly 30 years, in these fields of actually domestic criminal law. I was the Chief Military Prosecutor in the United Kingdom for nearly 7 years. And military law, I was an Army JAG, international criminal law, international humanitarian law, and human rights. My own modest pilgrimage, if you will. I don't use that word pilgrimage without thought or care. I'm not using the word in its strict religious sense, which, as you know, means traveling to a sacred place. But in many respects, I think anyone's journey in these particular fields forces you into direct confrontation with fundamental questions about good and evil, about mercy and justice, about reconciliation between all of us, and ultimately what we must aspire to be as human beings in the face of these massive crimes. What sort of world will we bequeath to our children and grandchildren? These are such difficult questions, and oftentimes, like prayer itself, they in fact remain unanswered. But I can assure you, over these 30 years, I have had glimpses of both hell and of heaven on earth. And those glimpses have had a profound effect on how I see the world, who I am, and what I feel about human suffering. I have honestly seen the most terrible things, but I've also borne witness to some of the most noble acts of sacrifice and love that I would never have seen if I had taken a different path in my life. So there it is. That's what I'm going to talk about. You'll be glad to hear fairly briefly today. So my first indirect experience of an ongoing war was in 1982. I was a schoolboy. It was the first war which left a very strong impression on me. As I say, I was still at school, but it was one of the first wars which was covered comprehensively and most importantly, contemporaneously by the media. So literally, we all saw the war as it was happening. It was a conflict over a remote archipelago in British overseas territory in the South Atlantic, 300 miles east of Argentina, 8,000 miles southwest of the United Kingdom. The 4,000 inhabitants of the Falkland Islands wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom in 1982. They still do today. The Argentinians claim this island, they call it the Malvinas. In April of 1982, Argentina, unlawfully, in breach of the United Nations Charter, invaded those islands. Back in 1982, the British Prime Minister, the late Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, as she was known, decided, much to the surprise of the world, which had seen the United Kingdom in decline for decades, to send a British Royal Navy and amphibious task force literally to the other side of the world to retake the Falkland Islands. Young men fought and died on both sides of that conflict, nearly 1,000 of them altogether. There were 2,500 seriously injured personnel on both sides. Britain was eventually victorious after 10 weeks of intense fighting. It was bitter and bloody combat, both at sea and on land and in the air, in brutal conditions in near freezing temperatures. In July of 1982, there was a service of Thanksgiving in Westminster Abbey in London. The then Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican Church, Robert Runcie, spoke for the nation. What he said about war, loss, and reconciliation, I have never forgotten. War, he said, was a profound sign of human failure. Much to the anger of Britain's political and military leaders of the day, he spoke of the grief and loss, both in the United Kingdom and in Argentina, of the dead and injured on both sides of the conflict. He movingly described a shared anguish, a common sorrow of both British and Argentinian mothers and loved ones. He expressed a very real sense that collective grief can be a beachhead of reconciliation between peoples who have been fighting and killing each other. Runcie was cast by his speech as weak and wet and ignoring the glory of this British military victory. What was not widely known at the time is that this devout and decent man knew war firsthand. He had fought through the Second World War as a tank commander. He had been decorated for bravery with the Military Cross. He spoke of war as he did because he'd seen it and he'd been part of it. He knew how terrible war was. Back in 1982, I had no idea then that the greatest part of my professional life would be dominated by war and human conflict. Strange to say, that's in fact been a mixed blessing for me. I've played a modest part in exposing some of the worst human atrocities of the last 30 years. I have met noble, silent, and extraordinary survivors of mass terror who I will not forget for as long as I live. In Croatia, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo, in Africa, and later in Cambodia. Today, in Israel and Palestine. With some fantastic colleagues, I saw the need for justice of a very great number of innocent people who had been murdered and abused, sometimes on an industrial scale. I participated in a number of international criminal trials where I think we demonstrated that the suffering and death of countless people had not been entirely useless to the progress of humanity. All these things have given me a very powerful sense of purpose in my life. Professionally, no one could have been more fortunate than me. The other side of it is, of course, a sense that perhaps these are very uncomfortable and painful issues, which are best quietly left to court records, legal textbooks, and the history books. The English poet, Edmund Blunden, who eventually became Professor of Poetry at Oxford University, fought through and survived the Great War. Speaking of his own memories of those terrible years, he said this: "They have haunted me all my life, and for many days I have, it seemed, lived in that world rather than this one." War is the darkest shadow, and it remains with us still, even 100 years on after the end of the Great War. We cannot ignore the agonies unfolding daily in the Ukraine and in the Middle East. Military tensions are now building across the Pacific. I just visited the island of Taiwan, where my second son was learning Mandarin, and you can sense uncertainty and apprehension among the inhabitants of that island. Up until July of this year, the United Nations had recorded 35,000 Ukrainian civilians either killed or injured since the conflict started. People very much like us, ladies and gentlemen. The estimates for military dead and injured are hard to verify, but the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense estimates that 450,000 Russian military personnel have been killed or injured up to April of this year, so in just over 2 years. The Ukrainian army has lost 200,000 soldiers through death and serious injury. These are truly staggering figures, comparable in scale to the casualty lists of the First and Second World Wars. Do we need reminding of why war is so terrible, and this is why we must do all we can by legal measures to try and stop it or reduce its worst consequences? In 1991, I was a newly qualified solicitor or attorney, as you would call me here in the United States. To everyone's very great surprise in that same year, I joined the British Army as a lawyer, a JAG, giving up the prospect of a comfortable and predictable life of a country lawyer on the south coast of England. But over 3 years, I travelled everywhere with the army, and my eyes were really open to the world. I was very lucky indeed. And then in 1994, something quite extraordinary happened. A corporal, a junior non-commissioned officer in the Cheshire Regiment, that's an infantry regiment of the British Army, had been charged with negligently shooting a fellow soldier while serving as part of the United Nations Protection Forces in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in the former Yugoslavia, in 1993. I was sent to defend him before a British military court in London in respect of the negligent shooting of this fellow soldier. The Cheshire Regiment had spent late 1992 and early 1993 as part of a United Nations military force trying to referee in a bloody and terrible civil war in the former Yugoslavia, where they'd witnessed horrors which at the time no one could quite comprehend or believe. The corporal, who I was defending, was mentally damaged by his experience, and I could see this fairly clearly when I met him and spoke with him. I was concerned about him, and I was also curious. And I asked him, "What is it that you saw in Bosnia?" He went very quiet, and then he told me there was a regimental video, a video recording showing the regiment's service in Bosnia. Well, I got hold of a copy of that video, and I watched it. And this video showed in the most graphic detail what this young man and his comrades had witnessed and endured. The most shocking episode recorded was the aftermath of the mass murder of the Bosniak inhabitants of the village of Armici in central Bosnia. On the 16th of April 1993, 120 men, women and children, the villagers of Armici, had been shot and killed in a meticulously planned military operation, and the entire village had been burnt to the ground. I recall that the Cheshire Regiment had dubbed into that video footage a very well-known song of the day by the brilliant Scottish singer Annie Lennox, who'd been the lead singer of the Eurythmics and then had had a very successful career as a solo artist. The song that she sang was called Why, and the words included these lines: "How many times do I have to try to tell you that I'm sorry for the things I've done? These are the tears we shed. This is the fear, this is the dread. These are the contents of my head." That music and those words captured this tragedy absolutely. So the following year, in 1995, I was sent by the British Army on secondment to the newly created United Nations International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague in the Netherlands. An international criminal tribunal, the first since Nuremberg, established by the UN Security Council to address crimes like those witnessed by these young soldiers of the Cheshire Regiment. Between 1991 and 1995, a violent and bloody civil war had raged in what was then Yugoslavia. So what is today Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Kosovo, and Vojvodina. The principal aim of that war, in particular in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Croatia, had been to terrorize the civilian population through murder, rape, torture, and the widespread and pervasive destruction of civilian housing. The war's primary purpose had been to control territory and to force massive and permanent displacement of the civilian population. It was a war where the guns were aimed very directly at the innocent, at the elderly, at women, and at children. In 1999, I recall, in the middle of one of our most shocking trials concerning the events of July of 1995 at Srebrenica, the United Nations publicly acknowledged that through error, misjudgment, and an inability to recognize the scope of the evil that was confronting the international community, they had failed to save the people of Bosnia from a campaign of mass murder. That was a public acknowledgement at the time. I was young, but that initial work in those first years filled me with a very great sense of indignation, of shock, of compassion, but also enduring anger. That these things had ever happened at all. I realized much later that Bosnia was not simply a military conflict. It was, like Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine today, a moral cause which requires our dedication and every last ounce of sweat and tears we possess. By 1999, I was junior prosecuting counsel in a major criminal trial which centered around what the Cheshire Regiment had witnessed at the village of Armici. Midway through that trial, the British Army quite legitimately called me home. I'd been at the tribunal then for over 3 years. I thought for a moment, and then I said to the Army, I have to stay here at the Yugoslav Tribunal, and I need to finish this trial. The UN fortunately offered me a job as junior trial counsel. I felt then, I still feel now, that the work we were doing together really mattered. It might not change the world tomorrow, next week, or even next year, or even in my lifetime, and it hasn't, has it? Yet. But there still is a real purpose in seeing how the world might look in 200 years' time, with armed conflict firmly controlled by law, where international relations are firmly and only governed by the laws of nations, where states peacefully coexist one with each other, where none of us, through an action or fear, will have to bear the innocent blood of children on our hands again, where we have sought by decisive action a world where strong nations are just, weaker nations are secure, and the peace is preserved. These are things that really count to many of us who've prosecuted in the international courts from those early days, and I'm sure they count to you as well. More specifically, let me show you why this work has mattered to me so much. Here are a few events I personally encountered over the last 3 decades as prosecuting counsel in a number of these cases. So the first example. On the 19th of April 1993, it was a beautiful, sunny spring day in the city of Zenica in central Bosnia-Herzegovina. There was a civil war, but there was a lull in the fighting, so hundreds of families who'd been hiding from the civil war for many months decided to emerge from their cellars and basements and enjoy the spring weather in the city square, to drink coffee and to allow their children to play. As I say, there had been a lull in the fighting. The air was clear, the guns were silent. Then, without any warning, enemy forces fired 6 howitzer shells directly into the city square. 15 civilians, most of them laughing, joyful children at play, were murdered, and 50 others suffered life-changing injuries. In January of 1998, I led in evidence at the Yugoslav Tribunal, the Bosnian investigating magistrate or judge assigned by the city of Zenica to investigate this shelling and killing. A most decent man who I remember very well, even today, called Mladen Vesliak. He described events to the tribunal in very great detail, with all the attention to the law and reliable evidence of any experienced criminal lawyer. He was absolutely meticulous, and his evidence to the tribunal was free from any anger or emotion, just the law and the facts. At the end of his investigation in the city square, he then proceeded to the city hospital to record the details of the dead and the injured. He walked down into the basement of the hospital where the mortuary was located and where the recovered bodies were being stored. You can imagine such a place in wartime. I visited the same place in 1995, and all I can say to you is it was the most terrible sight I've ever seen. The investigating judge described in evidence standing in the mortuary, recording the dead of the shelling as they were being brought in by the police and anyone else who could help. This is what he said in evidence to the tribunal, and I quote, namely, people were being brought in from the site whichever way was possible. Some people were brought in blankets, others were simply carried. Some people were brought in metal tubs, whatever they had. So when I came to the pathology ward, there were a lot of people ahead of me and they wanted to get in. I gave orders then not to receive anyone. When I walked in, I realized that somebody was standing behind me, and we were standing in front of a metal tub in which there was a young boy. The young boy was lying in it, I do not know, 13 or 14 years old. I just remember this dead child with a serene face. Nervously, I turned around and I saw a policeman in uniform standing behind me. So this was a good way of taking it out on someone else. And I told him, "What do you want, man? I told you no one was allowed in here." The man told me, quite composed, very quietly, "I have to be here, so this is my son." This measured, objective man, intellectually shaped and governed by the law, broke down before us as he recalled the boy in the wheelbarrow. The serene-faced boy, the pain and grief of a loving parent, was a symbolic of a war which had by then taken thousands of innocent lives. 2 years after events in Zenica, so in July of 1995, the Bosnian Muslim enclave of Srebrenica was overrun by the Bosnian Serb army. Over the course of 3 days, 25,000 women and children and elderly men were expelled from their homes, forcibly transferred from the place where they had lived all of their lives. We came to know eventually that nearly 8,500 men and boys from Srebrenica had been captured and summarily executed, their bodies buried and hidden in mass graves all over northeastern Bosnia. As the investigation of these events matured, the scale of this killing came into focus. None of us had expected this intensity of slaughter. At the time, it simply defied imagination. It was so shocking. The cold, brutal, meticulously organized mass murder of so many men and children. So in April 2000, we tried in court these events at Srebrenica. In the first trial for the crime of genocide at Srebrenica, I was junior prosecuting counsel. It's 24 years ago now. I led in evidence at trial a number of witnesses, survivors, including a wonderful, dignified, and stoical wife and mother, Misada Malagic from Srebrenica. I can see her here before me now. She had lost every single male member of her family. In her evidence, she concluded by stating this to the judges of the tribunal, and I quote, and I remember this as if it was yesterday. As for my testimony, I should like to finish it by saying something which is very important to me, and I believe for this court too. With the fall of Srebrenica, rather when it was taken by Bosnian Serb soldiers, when the soldiers took that so-called protected area of the United Nations, from the face of this earth were wiped off 3 generations of men in the cruelest way possible. I can corroborate it by a fresh example from my own family. My father-in-law, Omar Malagic, born in 1926, his 3 sons, one of whom was my husband, Salko Malagic, born in 1948, his 2 brothers, Osman Malagic, born in 1953, Jaffa Malagic, born in 1957, his 3 grandsons, that is my 2 sons, Elvir Malagic, born in 1973, Admir Malagic, born in 1979, and my brother-in-law's son, Samir Malagic's son, born in 1975. There are hundreds of such families in Srebrenica and throughout eastern Bosnia, and to my mind, this testifies to the scale of the genocide committed by Bosnian Serb soldiers. Lastly, in Cambodia, in 2011, I was confronted with a case involving a Khmer Rouge security or concentration camp called S21, where over 18,000 civilians were murdered in a little over 3 years, between 1975 and 1979. We were bringing to justice the camp commander, Doik, who had explained at trial that the policy of the camp had been to smash the enemies of the state. I discovered that to smash meant more than to kill. The commander of the camp, who interestingly pleaded guilty, described the meaning of smash to the court. To smash, he said, means to arrest secretly, to interrogate with torture employed, and then to execute secretly without the knowledge of the detainee's family members. It also meant that the person was never to be released. So if she was smashed, this did not go through the judicial process because there was no law, no court. The Standing Committee of the Communist Party governed all 3 main powers. Moreover, to smash was frequently translated as smash to bits, as in to smash into little pieces. It involved not merely a physical smashing, but also a psychological smashing. And the regime of the prisoner treatment inside S21 was ideally suited to this sort of dehumanization and debasement of the individual psyche. Smash means something more than merely killing somebody. I had the great professional satisfaction of ensuring, after appeal, that the man responsible for the running of this camp would die in prison. He did. He was never released. I want to really drive it home to you, if I haven't done already, in all these examples, that I'm talking about people like us. That's the one thing that I found more than anything. Ordinary people, just like me. The survivors and victims were soft-skinned, sentimental members of the human race with hopes and dreams. They loved, and they were dearly loved. They had all the problems that you and I have. They were very afraid. We're not. I came to know many of them well, even in death. I made it my business to know who they were, so that the accused would be fully confronted by the consequences of their acts. Guiltless human beings suffered and died in slaughterhouses, which is why I continue to feel so angry, and in particular when I see, like all of you, Ukraine under relentless attacks and Israel and Palestine subjected to such violence and terror. I'm often asked by young lawyers of how you enter this kind of work. My advice is always the same, and it's very straightforward. First, look at yourself in the mirror and ask how much are you prepared to give, and it's not just about time, it's about yourself, your heart and your mind, and then you must reach out into the darkness and grasp with your hands what you believe are the highest human values: decency, integrity, forbearance, patience, justice, love, and compassion, and then you've got to do all you damn well can to convince a violent, bleeding world that these are the only values that are worth fighting for. Because let's be frank, these are the values that victims of war and conflict are dying for every day. As I'm speaking, that's going on. Surely, in the end, is it not our sense of common humanity that, as Robert Runcie said, our neighbours are indeed just like us, that might ease the suffering and save this topsy-turvy, pitiful world? Much of this, I know, may sound to all of you like lofty, unrealistic ideals, but like all of you, my feelings, my view of the world have been shaped by my own experiences. When any of us bear witness to profound events, we feel things very profoundly. It's unavoidable. I have watched with absolute horror this seemingly endless war in Ukraine as it grinds on and on. On October the 7th, 2023, we all witnessed the killing of hundreds of Israeli civilians in attacks perpetrated by Hamas, in particular its military wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, and other armed groups, and the taking of at least 245 hostages. I've watched the murder of Israeli children, begging for their lives by Hamas fighters, caught on CCTV cameras outside a kibbutz. At the same time, now we are all watching the destruction of Gaza and its people. A doctor working in a hospital in Gaza told this account of a little boy brought into the hospital. This is what he said. Another patient came to the emergency room, multiple injuries. He's aged about 5 years. There were multiple injuries to the upper limbs, abdomen and chest. After the finish of surgery, we amputated both upper limbs, both hands. And I did abdominal surgery and chest surgery to remove the shrapnel. Second day, we extubate him from the ventilators. He started to talk to me and started to be conscious. On the fourth day post-operation, he was conscious and orientated. He asked me, "Doctor, inshallah, God willing, I will grow up." I told him, "Inshallah, God willing." He said to me, "When I grow up, doctor, will my hands grow again?" In God's name, what the hell are we doing as human beings that in 2024 we are still resorting to the use of lethal military force on this scale to pursue our national aims and to settle our disputes with each other? It beggars belief. My own feeling is it's simply blood on blood on blood. We should constantly remind ourselves that in the face of military attacks, there stand international treaties, solemn, weighty documents signed and ratified by almost every nation of the world, prohibiting the use of armed force against each other, save in self-defense or the common interest, limiting the worst aspects of warfare to preserve those who are not combatants from death and destruction. And speaking as I am today, we should force our leaders to think very carefully about their own moral foundation, what they most value. I have 4 children of my own. Many of you, some of you, I guess, will have children. When I look back over these 30 years at the mutilation and destruction of innocent children, I feel ashamed to be a member of the human race. Your own President, Jimmy Carter, said, "We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children." With so much war ongoing, peace is not something that is being discussed very much. The wars in Ukraine and the Middle East will go on, but surely there's got to come a moment when they will stop. All wars end. When enough blood has been shed, when the butcher's bill has been fully paid, peace must be restored. One of your great presidents, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in 1963, at the height of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, described peace as the most important topic on earth. At a time in history when the instruments of war had far outpaced the instruments of peace, Kennedy spoke of genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables human beings and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. He spoke not just of peace in our time, but peace for all time. In the last 60 years since Kennedy spoke those eloquent words, his hope of enduring and lasting peace has completely eluded us. Hope and prayers for peace are not enough. Let's face it, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The post-1945 international settlement and fragile order is now clearly failing across the globe. This has chilling implications for an increasingly divided and violent world. When the war does end in Ukraine and the Middle East, those international institutions established in the wake of the total destruction of the Second World War to preserve international peace and security must be reframed and reinvigorated. Why? Because the United Nations and its Security Council, the body given primary responsibility by the nations of the world for the maintenance of international peace and security, has been paralyzed and unable to come to Ukraine's defense with overwhelming force. Ukraine has been robbed of the noble intentions of the founders of the United Nations, and the Ukrainian people have paid in their own blood. The Permanent Court of International Justice in The Hague, the judicial arm of the United Nations, an international court charged with settling disputes between states peacefully and soberly by legal argument instead of by the bullet. That court has ordered a cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, and Russia has simply ignored the court's orders. The International Criminal Court, where I work, also in The Hague, given authority by the international community to investigate and prosecute individuals charged with the gravest crimes of concern to the international community: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. Russia does not even recognize the court. In Palestine and Israel, as I've already said, there is so much heat and very little light. Vladimir Putin is almost certainly guilty of the very worst crime of all, that of unlawful armed aggression, but he may never be tried. These international bodies we look to stop the horror of war and bring to justice those responsible are struggling. We must back these institutions to the hilt and reinvigorate them. Vladimir Putin cynically invoked Holy Scripture in support of his war efforts in Ukraine. He said, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." I will invoke the New Testament too, Mr. Putin. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. You can see here that there's still so much to be done, and often it seems completely overwhelming. But then I remind myself that we can do this. We can, because we've done it before, and we can do it again. Nothing I ever did in my working life was as professionally fulfilling as being part of the prosecution of those guilty of murdering 8,500 men and boys at Srebrenica in July of 1995. It felt vital to all of us involved because we were privileged, and I say privileged with emphasis, to play a modest role in giving a living voice to those who never stood a chance. Robert Kennedy said that only earthbound man still clings to the dark and poisoning superstition that his world is bounded by the nearest hill. His universe ends at river shore. His common humanity is enclosed in the tight circle of those who share his town or his views and the color of his skin. It is your job, the task of the young people in this world, to strip the last remnants of that ancient cruel belief from the civilization of humankind. And at Srebrenica we tried to do exactly that. I'll move to my concluding remarks now. I want to reassure you, all of you, that accepting Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine, for each of those cases I mentioned today, those responsible for these awful crimes were charged, arrested, and then tried in fair and free trials before international courts. They, in fact, enjoyed every legal right they never gave a living soul, and that was absolutely fundamental, that none of these trials should be seen as exclusively pursuing retribution or vengeance. Almost all were convicted, many remain incarcerated. Mr. Putin might wish to reflect on these things, however unrealistic such a prospect may seem today. So what is the worth of what I've said? First, I think it reminds us all that the only guide to any one of us is our conscience, and the only shield to our memory is the rectitude and sincerity of our actions. I say this because in prosecuting these cases, there is a temptation to forget or ride roughshod over precepts of fair trials and basic honesty. Ends justifying means amongst the horror. But the fact is, we have to cling to decency and rectitude, even in the face of mass murder, because justice, being even-handed, forces the cup we poison back to our own lips. That's William Shakespeare from Macbeth, not Andrew Cayley. I've covered some grim issues today. I hope you will forgive me. Fact is, we must keep hope in all of this. Hope is the one thing that can see us through. And I mean here the active doing kind of hope, of getting off my backside every day and working purposefully in difficult circumstances that often seem insurmountable, with my magnificent colleagues in The Hague, and watching as the next generation of young, courageous lawyers comes forward to take up the fight, passing on to them what I can and is of use for them. That's a real privilege for me, because often justice can seem very far away indeed, as if it's always over the horizon. But when you are surrounded by the young, with all of their idealism, their compassion, and righteous anger, you come to believe that absolutely anything is possible, worlds unimagined. And let me end with a US maverick historian, a man called Professor Howard Zinn. I've always admired him as a writer, and he wrote this about hope. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in absolute defiance of everything that's bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the very great honor you've bestowed upon me today. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes for questions and answers if you're taking them. Can you give a microphone? Yep. Okay. Just raise your hand and the mics will come to you.
Good evening. Thank you for wonderful remarks. I have a question sort of about the follow-up to the work that you do on the court. When we talk about restabilization, right, whether it's Ukraine or Palestine or, Bosnia, right, what does the transitionary period look like, when we're trying to restabilize some of these organizations? Maybe that's not necessarily relevant to the work that you do, but would love to hear a little bit about your perspective on once we started prosecuting some of these people and we're trying to bring these countries back, right, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I confess I'm not an expert on it. As far as legal work is concerned, certainly what we've tried to do, and certainly in Bosnia that was true, in Cambodia it was true, at least from the perspective of what I was doing, we tried to build legal capacity in their own system, because in these countries, the legal system was just shattered by war, conflict, the troubles, Cambodia, the period of the Khmer Rouge. So a lot of the work that we were doing in terms of not just prosecuting in the international court itself, so not just prosecuting in the Yugoslav tribunal, but going out and supporting the sort of the rebuilding of their own legal system. So I was involved in that. But it's very, very difficult. I mean, if if you look at Palestine now, the Palestine case, Gaza, it's flat. I mean, there's a recent report in The Economist. It's like a moonscape. I mean, it's going to take many, many, many decades to rebuild it. And that's what happens in every conflict. It takes decades to rebuild. It was the same in Bosnia. I mean, Cambodia, actually, by the time the trials started, the country had actually largely, been rebuilt because we were prosecuting cases that were 30 years old. So, a lot of the rebuilding had gone on. But we were also involved heavily in building legal capacity in Cambodia because the legal system had never fully recovered, because the Khmer Rouge had killed all the qualified lawyers and judges. So, yes, the rebuilding process of these countries that are subjected to these major traumas takes decades. And now we're just talking about institutions. The people as well are traumatized for decades. And that trauma is passed from one generation to another. I mean, I felt that in Cambodia, even 30 years on. Any family that you spoke to, they had missing relatives, people that had vanished under the Khmer Rouge regime. And you felt a sense of trauma in the country. People had been heavily traumatized by events. So you have to also care for people that are damaged, as well as just all the infrastructure of a nation. I mean, this is why I said at the beginning why war is so terrible, and we have to stop it.
Hello. So the court has issued several high-profile indictments out of the Gaza genocide. It's no secret that the court does not have the power to arrest those individuals, certainly of its own accord. My question is what you view as the court's role in the interim. I know you have no shortage of work at the moment, but do you consider the court taking on a monitoring function in the interim, or what activities does the court engage in as those arrests pend?
So, I mean, I think I can speak generally about this and about, particularly the prosecutor's intentions around the Palestine case. I mean, I think it's best for me to say here that we are going to follow the legal process, which is we're making, the prosecutors made 5 applications for warrants of arrest. They're under judicial consideration. His view is that he would like those applications considered as soon as possible and warrants issued. That's the position of the prosecutor. We continue to investigate within the jurisdiction that we have in that case, and we continue to consider evidence, as we gather it, essentially, and the prosecutor will make decisions around that evidence. So that's really the sum of what I can say in terms of what we're doing on Palestine. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for all the work that you have done and your really inspiring remarks. I'm wondering what is your view of the role of various states exercising universal jurisdiction in the face of such crimes, and how the International Criminal Court acts or should act in relation to those states?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, the International Criminal Court is a complementary jurisdiction. So the expectation, to explain that for everybody here, the International Criminal Court was set up upon the basis that domestic states should themselves deal with these crimes. That's quite complex if you think about it, because oftentimes the leadership of a state is involved in these massive crimes, and to expect them themselves to essentially prosecute themselves, I mean, that's the paradox of the court, that we expect cooperation from those that we're prosecuting. So that's the expectation. And in terms of universal jurisdiction, some crimes are so serious that any state essentially can prosecute those crimes. And I think, and I may be wrong here, but I'm pretty certain that we have not actually had any sort of formal relationship with a state exercising that universal jurisdiction. I mean, it has happened. I know there are examples. So, for example, in Syria, which is a case over which we don't have jurisdiction, there have been prosecutions in Spain, I think, exercising universal jurisdiction for crimes committed there. But I cannot actually think of an example off the top of my head of a situational case that we have where another state has exercised universal jurisdiction in respect of that situation, if you see what I mean. So it's actually quite hard for me to comment on what our relationship would be because I'm not aware of any examples. But it's an interesting question how our relationship might be with a state that was exercising universal jurisdiction in terms of a situation that was within our jurisdiction and how we would deal with that state. I mean, I tend to think those cases, there haven't been that many, and there's not that many states that are prepared to do it because of all of the implications of exercising universal jurisdiction for other big states like the United States, for example, who would not want universal jurisdiction exercised in respect of any of its own citizens, right? Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. What a pleasure to hear from you again. My question has to do with your own career. You worked at all these different tribunals, the Cambodia Tribunal, the Yugoslavia Tribunal, now the ICC. Can you tell us a little bit about the different challenges or opportunities regarding working at the different tribunals? You know, is your job as the ICC prosecutor today easier than your job was in Cambodia? You know, how do the different tribunals compare when you work as a prosecutor?
Yeah. I think interestingly, the Yugoslav Tribunal was the most straightforward court to work in, and I touched on this yesterday, if you remember, because the Yugoslav Tribunal was a product of a Security Council resolution, and all states in the world, well, there's a couple that sort of, yeah, not every state, but just about every state in the world is a member of the United Nations. So there was a sense, because of that everybody was bound by the decision of the Security Council to set up this court. So whilst there were problems with cooperation at the beginning, there was a sense amongst nations that they had to do what the court requested or ordered. So that made life a lot easier. Also, as the life of that court went on, we got massive support from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, you know, largely supported by the United States, from the European Union, massive support. Money was used to persuade states financial aid was given to states in order to persuade them to give up suspects. So the court functioned really very well. Now, the International Criminal Court, of course, is a treaty-based organization, and if you're not a member state, you don't have to comply. So if you don't belong to the court, if you haven't signed and ratified the treaty, you absolutely do not have to cooperate with the court. Also, in a sense, states who are members, there isn't the same urgency, at least in my experience, of cooperating with the court as there was with the Yugoslav Tribunal. So cooperation is more of a challenge with the International Criminal Court than it was with the Yugoslav Tribunal. With the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, that was a very challenging court to work in because it was a hybrid court. It was staffed by both Cambodian jurists and international staff like myself. The government of Cambodia kept a very close eye on what was going on in the court and wanted to essentially, you know, for its own reasons, it wanted to limit the jurisdiction of the court to a certain number of cases, and they interpreted the statute and the rules of the court to allow them to do this. And it meant that quite a number of cases that should have been heard and decided never were, because effectively the government didn't want those cases, and because they had their own judges and prosecutors in the court, they could make sure that it didn't happen. So we had 2 major cases, but 3 cases were never heard. So that was a case where, because of the political control of the government over courts that were supposed to be independent, it meant that cases were not heard. Now, the cases that were heard, to be fair, I think were, you know, they do they do survive scrutiny. They had integrity, those cases. But the very fact that 3 cases were not heard because the government essentially didn't want them heard, that damaged the legacy of the court. So I think if I was to sort of put them in order, the easiest, or the not, it's never easy, this work, but the most straightforward court, the most effective court that worked the best was the Yugoslav tribunal, and I think the Rwanda tribunal was largely the same because it was the same model. Then I think the ICC probably comes second, and I think unfortunately the Khmer Rouge Tribunal comes third. The Special Court for Sierra Leone, which I didn't work, I defended there, but I never prosecuted. That was very similar to the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. It had both Sierra Leonean jurists and also international stuff. That was a much more successful model than the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, much more successful, because I don't think they had the political intrusion into the court that we had.
Other hands somewhere over there? Yeah.
Hi.
Can you wait for the microphone just a second? There you go.
Hello. I was wondering, during your time as a prosecutor, or during it, like as a prosecutor, what have you felt has been the most effective way to tell your story and to persuade your jury to a verdict, the verdict you were looking for?
I think actually, that's a really good question, actually. That's a really good question. I think it was actually oftentimes through survivors. I think the survivors had, so leading a survivor witness had the most powerful effect on the court. And I'll give you an example actually of an example that I didn't actually include in my remarks, but you can look it up, it's on the ICTY website. There's a witness actually that I led called Witness O, who was a 16-year-old boy, actually just 16, he was 15 when he left Srebrenica. He had his birthday while he was leaving Srebrenica, and he, for various reasons which I won't go into, he survived an execution site. And when he came to the court to give evidence, he was, it was then 4 years later, so he was 20 by the time he came to give evidence. But the memory of these events was absolutely etched in his mind. I mean, there was, you don't forget these things when they happen to you. But he was in a very bad place when he arrived, actually, and I could tell because we always met these victims. Many of these people had never been in a courtroom in their lives, so they didn't really understand the process. I mean, he was a very bright kid, actually, but he'd just never been outside of Bosnia. So I met him the night before, and I had a very, very difficult evening with him, trying to get him to read his statement and refresh his memory, and he was angry and upset. And in the end, I just stopped and thought, I'll let him go back to his hotel and let him get some sleep, and that he did. And then he gave evidence the next day, and I took the biggest risk I've ever taken in my life with a witness, where I could see he was extremely nervous in the courtroom. He was shaking in the seat, and I said to him, look, let me let you into a secret. I said, anybody in a court, I said, even me, I feel anxious. I said, not as anxious as you, but I do actually feel anxious. So just relax and tell the story. Just tell the judges what happened. So normally you'd obviously question a witness to direct them, and I just let him go. And it's an incredible piece of evidence. I never asked one question, so I'm not responsible for it, but the quality of his evidence was just incredible. He told this chronology of events from beginning to end in a sequential order. He even remembered times of things. He was just fantastic as a witness. And I remember there was an American judge, very famous American judge called Patricia Walls. She died actually a few years ago, but she was one of the best judges at the ICTY. She was a federal appellate judge from the DC circuit, wasn't she? So basically one below the Supreme Court, effectively. Is that right? Yeah. So, a really, really senior judge. And at the end of his evidence, the judges said to him, have you got anything that you want to add to what you've said? And by then, you could have had a pin drop, basically, in the room. And this is a 20-year-old who'd been 15 or 16 at the time. And he said, I just wanted to say this to you. these were really terrible things that happened. They should never have happened. But if I had the right, in the name of all of those people that were murdered, I would actually forgive. He's actually spoke of forgiveness. I would forgive the perpetrators because they had been misled by the leaders. And actually, it was an unbelievable thing to hear, and it was absolutely excellent for us because we were prosecuting the leaders. We were not prosecuting the people that pulled the trigger. So I suppose I give you that example because it was powerful. And Patricia Wald, I remember her saying, in that classic American way, I mean, you could see she was extremely moved by this evidence. You could see it on her face. And I mean, for a very senior judge to be moved like that is unusual. And she said, I remember overhearing her because her microphone had not been switched off. And she said, that kid deserves a break, a big break. That's what she said. And it kind of lightened things a bit. But she was very moved. And I mean, she was then, in her mid-70s. She'd been sitting for about 40 years on the bench, I think. She was very young, wasn't she, to the bench, I think. So yeah, it's through the witnesses that you persuade judges about these things. Yeah, the victims.
That's a good place to end. I'm seeing the time sign. We want to invite everybody to join us. I'm going to say this. For wine and cheese for world peace. I don't know what they're serving upstairs tonight, but we'd love you to join us. We're going to have a reception from now to about 6